So at my drill press, I'm going to use a Forstner bit. In fact, it's the biggest one I happen to have and sharpest. And I'm going to use that to plow away the bulk of the material here. There's no reason to use your router for all this. It's going to basically save wear and tear on your bit and on the router itself. The only thing we need to be concerned about is the depth. How far down does this bit go? Now, I've got a mark here at about 5/8 of an inch, and the instructions tell me that you want at least a 1/2 inch bottom for this bowl. So at 5/8, I think, as long as I'm a little bit over, I'm fine with that. So I'm going to use that line to set the depth of the bit. And right about there should do the trick. One down, a couple thousand to go. Now before doing any routing, I'm going to attach the template to the workpiece with screws. Normally I use double stick tape for this kind of thing, but I don't really want to take any chances that this is going to move on me. So a couple of countersunk screws will do the trick. Two things to be very careful of here. Number one, you want to make sure that the countersink is deep enough that the screw doesn't doesn't sit proud of the surface, because that'll get in the way of our router. And the second thing is you want to make sure that these screws are well inside the waste that we'll be cutting away later. And these are definitely way out there. So now I've got my router outfitted with the plastic base that's going to give me all the extra support that I need to span that gap. And I even have my router bit in here, which is the special pattern bit with a rounded bottom. That's going to be perfect for making this bowl. Now, the first pass that I'm going to take is going to be around the perimeter. And the idea is I want to be very careful because I still have a lot of material to remove. And all those waves from the router bit, or from the Forstner bit, every time the bit confronts one of those waves, it's going to want to push it along. It's all of a sudden a big chunk of material. So you have to take it slow and just make sure we make that first pass around without going too fast. So we'll take our time with it. So for this first pass, I'm going to set my bit height so that the bearing is just above my plexiglass base, which means it'll ride nice and secure against the template. So push it down and lock it in place. Yeah, that looks good. Now we're ready to rock and roll. You can see we're starting to establish our shape nicely here. It's starting to look really good. I think I'm going to get rid of this big giant piece of material here. That just looks like it is going to be trouble. So now I'm going to lower the bit about 1/4 inch more, and I'm just going to keep going lower and lower until I reach the full extent, or until I reach the bottom. And it depends on your setup, how deep your bowl is, depends on your router. Now you'll notice that eventually the bearing comes off of the template and it starts riding along the surface of the wood, which is perfectly fine because the wood is the same shape as the template. So just keep going down, down, down until you hit the bottom. Now I'm going to remove the template because at this point it's not really serving any purpose. This will allow me to get a little bit more out of my router bit. Now I'm getting ready to do my final cleanup pass, and you could tell basically because the bit is contacting the bottom, which means when I start the router, I'm going to just start it with it lifted up and then slowly bring it down. I probably will do the perimeter first and then work my way sort of freeform in the center areas, and hopefully we'll clean it all out and it'll be uneventful. Now that pretty much does it. It's a pretty nice smooth bottom. The corners are nice. A little bit of sanding. I don't think it's going to need much more work. Now there are a few high points that I couldn't hit with the router, and frankly I'm blind when I have the router up there. I can't see anything, so it's going to be a little tricky to get those. So I'm just going to use a chisel with the bevel down like this, and I'll be able to flatten that area out and remove the excess material. Now we're going to need to trace around the outside perimeter using a compass just to basically create the rim. And again, this is something that's adjustable, depends on what your personal preference is. I'm going for a little bit over a ½ inch here, and I'm just going to trace around. Now at the bandsaw, I've got a nice narrow blade here that's going to be very helpful for getting around all these tight corners and things. And I'm just going to take my time. This is not something you want to rush. So I'm going to try and trace around very carefully and get as close to my line as I possibly can. The better I am at this, the less I'm going to have to sand later.
Even though I have a pretty narrow blade, I still like to make relief cuts in the deep valleys whenever possible. This takes a lot of pressure off the blade when it comes time to turn those sharp corners. Also keep in mind that the sharper you make those inside corners, the harder it's going to be to sand. So I'm keeping mine relatively round. I do the final shaping on the outside using an oscillating spindle sander.
Now with the bulk of the outside sanded, I have to get all of these little parts here. If you don't have an oscillating spindle sander, that's okay. You can still get most of these, with a sanding block of some sort. And I'll show you a couple little sanding implements that I have that really make this go faster. But at this point, really, there's nothing left to do but put it in the bench, start sanding. So what I'm going to use mostly here are these little sanding helpers. They're just rubber, flexible sanding pads. And you sort of just wrap a piece of sandpaper around them like this. And you could really get down into those tight areas and just kind of wrap around here. If you want to, you could use the other end, and you can see some of them have different profiles, and you could try to match the profile of some of these inner curves. Sand this way, roll it through like that. There's a lot of different things that you can do, but there's no way to get around it. You need to sand a lot here to make sure that this, the end grain looks good and the side grain looks good. Now with the outside sanded to 180 grit, of course you can go to 220 if you like, 180 is where I like to stop. We've got to sand the inside here, and this is not the easiest thing to do. You're going to have to get creative and do the best you can. The good news is that the surface left by the router bit is pretty darn smooth, so honestly it doesn't need a whole lot of work. But for the most part in here, I think this is going to have to be by hand. All these inside side walls, this little curvature here down at the bottom. But fortunately your fingers are actually pretty good sanding blocks for stuff like this. So just take your time and get it right. Now one thing that may wind up getting you here is these really deep corners in there. A little bit tricky to get to. I found that if I've got some burning down there, my flex cut carving tools would sort of have this interchangeable handle. I've got various different profiles that I can use, and those are very, very handy for getting down into these corners and just kind of scooping up a little bit and pulling out some wood. These are very sharp, so a couple strokes is all it takes to get the burnt stuff off, and then if you can, try and squeeze some sandpaper down there and smooth it out. Now of course with a candy dish like this, or really any woodworking project, you want to make sure that your corners are broken to some extent. So just a little bit of sandpaper is all it takes to ease the edges, and that'll stop little hands from getting splinters and cuts and things like that. Or you could take it to the extent that I did. You could use a small roundover bit on all these edges to give it a nice clean, consistent, and soft look. So of course you want to do the inside edge, the outside edge, and this bottom edge too.